You know, sometimes I wonder if I was too harsh, too unforgiving, but then I remember the look on their faces, the sneer as they talked about my economy class ticket, and all that doubt just vanishes. $41 million. That's how much my grandfather, a man I barely knew, but who was apparently a shipping magnate, left behind. And my cousins, the golden children, the ones who had always treated me like I was a speck of dirt under their designer shoes. They thought they had it all sewn up. They thought they'd split it, every last cent, and I'd be left with nothing but the memory of their laughter. They mocked my plane ticket to Monaco, my one-way, cheap-as-chips flight to the reading of the will, until the man in Monaco, the family lawyer, cleared his throat and started reading. Tell me, would you have done anything differently if you were me? Let me take you back to the beginning, before the private jets and the mocking. My grandfather, Arthur Sterling, was a name whispered in hushed tones in our family. He was a phantom, a myth. I saw him maybe twice in my life, once at a very young age, a blurry memory of a stern man with kind eyes, and once more at a family gathering when I was a teenager, where he barely acknowledged my presence. He was a self-made man, built an empire from nothing, but he was also estranged from most of the family, including my own father, his youngest son. My father had chosen a simpler life, a quiet life, far away from the glitz and the relentless pursuit of wealth that defined his father. He was a high school teacher, and my mother was a nurse. We weren't poor, not by any stretch, but we certainly weren't in the same league as my Uncle Richard and Aunt Carol, Arthur's elder children, and their progeny, my cousins, Jeremy and Tiffany. Jeremy and Tiffany were everything I wasn't. They had attended elite boarding schools, drove luxury cars the moment they turned 16, and flaunted their trust funds like they were medals of honor. I, on the other hand, worked hard, put myself through state university, and dreamed of a career in publishing, a world away from their opulent lives. Our family gatherings, which were rare and always strained, were a masterclass in passive aggression from their side. Tiffany would make snide comments about my clothes, my career choices, even my choice of coffee. Jeremy would dismiss my opinions with a wave of his hand, often turning to his father, Uncle Richard, for validation, as if my words were beneath him. Their parents, Uncle Richard and Aunt Carol, were just as bad, if not worse. They saw my father's simple life as a personal affront to their own grandiosity, a betrayal of the Sterling name. They constantly reminded him, and by extension me, that we were the poor side of the family, the ones who had chosen mediocrity over ambition. So, when the news of Grandpa Arthur's passing reached us, it was a strange mix of emotions. There was a faint sadness for a man I barely knew, but mostly there was a sense of dread. I knew what this meant. It meant a trip to Monaco, where Grandpa Arthur had retired, and another round of being subjected to my cousin's disdain. My father, surprisingly, seemed to take it in stride. He said Arthur had always been a complex man, and that he wished things had been different, but he wasn't holding out any hope for an inheritance. He knew his father, he said, and Arthur valued ambition above all else. He assumed the bulk of the estate would go to Richard and Carol, who had followed in their father's footsteps, albeit with less success than Arthur himself. The invitation to the will reading arrived a few weeks later. It was a formal, engraved affair, flown in by express courier. It stated that all direct descendants were required to be present in Monaco. My father, with a wry smile, simply handed me the envelope. "Looks like you're going to Monaco, son," he said. "Don't expect much, but at least you'll get a free trip." Free trip, indeed. The fine print mentioned that travel expenses would be reimbursed upon proof of attendance and a valid claim . Knowing my cousins, I knew what that meant. They'd probably fly first class, stay in 5-star hotels, and then expect me to fight for my bus fare. I decided to be pragmatic. I booked the cheapest economy class ticket I could find, a red-eye flight with 2 layovers, and found a reasonably priced air, a little further from the bustling city center. I wasn't going there to impress anyone. I was going because I had to. The day of the will reading arrived, and I found myself in the opulent waiting room of a Monegasque law firm, feeling utterly out of place. Jeremy and Tiffany were already there, draped in designer clothes, sipping espresso served by a discreet assistant. They barely acknowledged me when I walked in, save for a quick, dismissive glance. Uncle Richard and Aunt Carol were deep in conversation with a distinguished-looking man, presumably the family lawyer. They looked smug, confident like cats who had just swallowed the canary. "Oh, look who it is," Tiffany drawled, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "The prodigal cousin. Did you enjoy your scenic tour of Europe on your budget airline, darling?" Jeremy snickered, and Uncle Richard shot me a look that was a mixture of disdain and pity. "Yes, well, some of us have to be fiscally responsible," I replied, trying to keep my voice even. "Not all of us have Daddy's trust fund to fall back on." That shut them up for a moment, but Tiffany quickly recovered. "Oh, darling, don't pretend you're not here for the same reason we are. Though I doubt Grandpa Arthur even remembered you existed." Jeremy chimed in, "Yeah, I heard he cut off your dad ages ago. Don't expect a penny, pal." They continued to mock my choice of travel, my modest clothes, and my general lack of sterling panache. Right up until the lawyer, Monsieur Dubois, entered the room and invited us into a larger, more formal office. The room was grand, with dark wood paneling, leather chairs, and a massive mahogany table. Monsieur Dubois, a man with a silver mane and an impeccably tailored suit, sat at the head of the table, a thick sheaf of papers in front of him. We all took our seats, the tension in the air so thick you could cut it with a knife. Uncle Richard and Aunt Carol were practically radiating anticipation, while Jeremy and Tiffany exchanged knowing glances. I just sat there, bracing myself for the inevitable humiliation. Monsieur Dubois cleared his throat, adjusted his spectacles, and began to speak. He started with the usual pleasantries, a brief eulogy for Grandpa Arthur, acknowledging his remarkable life and achievements. Then he got down to business. He stated that Arthur Sterling's estate was valued at precisely $41 million. A collective gasp went around the room, mostly from my cousins, who suddenly looked like they'd won the lottery. Uncle Richard and Aunt Carol exchanged triumphant smiles. Monsieur Dubois then began to read the will. He started with the smaller bequests, various charities, long-time employees, and a few distant relatives I'd never heard of. My cousins kept nudging each other, their eyes gleaming with avarice. Then he got to the main beneficiaries. He read to my eldest son, Richard Sterling, and his wife, Carol Sterling, for their unwavering support and continued dedication to the Sterling legacy. I bequeath the sum of $1 million each. Richard and Carol's smiles faltered slightly. $1 million each was a lot of money, but it was a far cry from what they were expecting from a $41 million estate. They exchanged confused glances. Then Monsieur Dubois continued to my grandchildren, Jeremy Sterling and Tiffany Sterling. For their youthful exuberance and future endeavors, I bequeath the sum of $500,000 each. Now, the smiles on Jeremy and Tiffany's faces had completely vanished, replaced by open-mouthed shock. $500,000 was a nice chunk of change, but again, nowhere near what they had envisioned. They looked utterly bewildered, and a faint flicker of amusement stirred within me. So that's the situation I was in, and I had to make a choice. Before I tell you what happened next, I want you to pause and comment below what you would have done in my shoes. Would you have spoken up? Would you have savored the moment? Or would you have been as stunned as everyone else? Let me know your thoughts before I reveal the bombshell that Monsieur Dubois dropped next. Monsieur Dubois paused, took a sip of water, and then his gaze shifted directly to me. My heart started to pound. He cleared his throat once more, and then, with a slow, deliberate cadence, he read, and finally, to my youngest son's child, my grandson, my name, for his quiet strength, his independent spirit, and his genuine desire to forge his own path, free from the constraints of expectation, I bequeath the remainder of my estate, totaling $38 million, along with all properties and business holdings. The silence in the room was deafening. You could have heard a pin drop. My jaw, I'm pretty sure, was on the floor. I stared at Monsieur Dubois, then at my cousins, then at my aunt and uncle, who all looked as if they'd been struck by lightning. Their faces were a masterpiece of shock, disbelief, and a dawning, horrifying realization. Tiffany was the first to break the silence. "What?" she shrieked, her voice cracking. "That's impossible. Grandpa barely knew him. He hated his father." Jeremy, equally outraged, slammed his hand on the table. "This is a joke. There has to be a mistake." Uncle Richard, his face purple with rage, sputtered, "Monsieur Dubois, this is preposterous. My father would never do such a thing. He built this empire for us. Monsieur Dubois, unflappable, calmly raised a hand. "The will is clear, Mr. Sterling. It was drafted personally by Mr. Arthur Sterling himself several years ago and reaffirmed just months before his passing. He left a detailed letter explaining his wishes." He then proceeded to read excerpts from the letter. It spoke of how my grandfather admired my father's decision to pursue a life he found fulfilling, rather than chasing after wealth and status. It spoke of his disappointment in Uncle Richard and Aunt Carol, for their perceived avarice and their constant attempts to pit family members against each other. And then it spoke of me. My grandfather had apparently been watching me from afar. He mentioned how I had chosen to pursue an education and a career based on passion, not profit, and how I had never once asked him for anything. He lauded my independence, my quiet dignity, and my refusal to be drawn into the family's materialistic squabbles. He even mentioned how he admired my decision to fly economy to Monaco, seeing it as a sign of humility and practicality, rather than what my cousins perceived as a sign of poverty. He stated that he believed I, out of all his descendants, had the character and the integrity to use his wealth wisely, not to squander it on frivolous pursuits, but to make a real difference. My cousins were speechless, their faces contorted with a mixture of anger and humiliation. Tiffany's perfectly applied makeup started to run as tears of fury streamed down her face. Jeremy looked like he was about to explode. Uncle Richard and Aunt Carol were incandescent with rage, but Monsieur Dubois simply looked at them with a detached expression. He explained that there was a clause in the will. Any attempt to contest it would result in the challenging party being disinherited completely, and their portion would be added to my share. That shut them up pretty quickly. The idea of losing even their relatively paltry inheritance was enough to keep them from outright exploding. The meeting concluded with me, still in a state of shock, signing a few papers, and Monsieur Dubois explaining the next steps. As I walked out, my cousins and aunt and uncle practically shoved, passed me without a word, their faces dark and thunderous. I overheard Tiffany muttering something about the pauper inheriting the kingdom. I just smiled, a genuine, unforced smile, and kept walking. I didn't say a word, didn't gloat, didn't even make eye contact. Their humiliation was enough. The aftermath was, predictably, chaotic. News of the inheritance spread like wildfire through the family, and I was suddenly inundated with calls from relatives I hadn't heard from in years. My cousins, of course, tried to spread rumors, implying I had manipulated my grandfather, or that the will was fake. But Monsieur Dubois had anticipated all of this and had ironclad documentation and witnesses. The truth was undeniable. My father was ecstatic, not for the money itself, but for the validation of his own life choices and the recognition of my grandfather's true character. He shed tears of pride, telling me how proud Arthur would have been of me. I decided to use the money responsibly, just as my grandfather had hoped. I established a foundation in his name, focusing on literacy and education, particularly for underprivileged youth, a cause I deeply cared about. I invested wisely, ensuring the money would not only last but also grow. I bought my parents a comfortable home, free from the worries of mortgages and bills, and ensured they could enjoy their retirement. I kept my own life relatively simple, continuing my work in publishing, albeit with the freedom to pursue projects I was truly passionate about. I didn't buy a private jet or a yacht. I still flew economy sometimes, just to remind myself of where I came from, and to honor the unexpected legacy of a man who saw something in me that no one else in our family seemed to. The last I heard, my cousins were still fuming. Jeremy had apparently tried to launch a lavish startup with his inheritance, which promptly failed, and Tiffany was embroiled in a messy divorce, her husband having left her for another woman. Uncle Richard and Aunt Carol were still living in their opulent mansion, but the shine seemed to have gone out of their lives. They were consumed by bitterness and regret, constantly reliving the day the man in Monaco read the will. I, on the other hand, found a quiet peace. The money gave me freedom, but the lesson, the validation from my grandfather, gave me something far more valuable, a sense of purpose and a clear understanding of what truly matters in life. So, that's my story. It's been a wild ride, and I'm still processing it all. Like this video, if you were on my side, if you think Grandpa Arthur made the right choice. Subscribe for more stories like this, where the unexpected twists and turns of life truly surprise you. And please, share your final thoughts on this whole mess in the comments section below. What would you have done with $38 million? I'll see you all in the next story.